"Marcus, we need you." That's what he said, but it was already too late. My name is Marcus Lee. I'm 36 years old, and I used to be the guy who fixed everything before it broke. Not anymore. These days, I drink my morning coffee slowly. I wake up without alarms. I walk past hotel lobbies I don't work for, and I don't have to care how their systems run. But this morning, I got a call from someone who used to think I was too small time for his big plans. The screen lit up Dominic Shaw, ex-CEO of the Aurelios Group, the man who fired me 2 years ago, because in his words, we need someone who thinks on a global scale. I didn't answer. I let it ring until it stopped. 30 seconds later, a voicemail came in. "Marcus, it's Dominic. I know it's been a while, but we're having a situation down in Miami. We need help badly. The system, it's not responding. If you could call me back, whatever your rate is, we'll cover it." I listened once, then I played it again just to be sure I heard what I thought I heard. The man who called me obsolete now couldn't even open his own hotel's access dashboard. And you know what? I didn't feel angry. Not anymore. I just sat there thinking about how all this started. It's funny. They always think they're upgrading when they cut you out, until something breaks. Then they realize they never understood how it worked in the first place. Back then, I wasn't anyone important. No flashy title. No LinkedIn followers. Just a guy who built systems that didn't crash during weddings with 300 VIP guests and Secret Service-level security protocols. I never advertised my work. I just made sure it didn't fail. My office was a converted closet near the back entrance of the hotel. I worked behind the scenes because that's where the logic lives. Hidden, silent, but essential. They called me the quiet one on staff, and that was fine. Because when you're invisible, you get to see everything. You see which vendors lie about integrations. You see which managers forward your emails with their names signed at the bottom. You see who walks in like they own the place and who actually makes things run. Dominic didn't see any of it. He arrived during the rebranding. Aurelios Hotels had just bought out the chain I worked for. He was young, aggressive, global. And I was the local guy who built a local tool. At least that's what he told the board. So he brought in vendors, big-name consultants, cloud migration teams with 6-figure presentations and 0 working code. And me, I just packed up my bag when they let me go. No press, no drama, no farewell speech in the break room. But I left something behind, something no one asked about. I built that system from scratch over 6 years. A backend framework for managing event-level guest access, anonymous payment routing, secure token entry for clients who required privacy at the highest level. We had senators, billionaires, political donors, foreign dignitaries. Not one leak, not one breach, ever. Because I wrote the rules. I knew which strings connected what. And I never handed over the core license. They never thought to ask. Now, 2 years later, they're calling me because it won't work anymore. The new vendor can't fix it. The system doesn't recognize their inputs. Because the encryption handshake was never reissued. Because that protocol was tied to me. I could have answered. I could have flown to Miami, charged 10 grand for the hour, walked in like a messiah. But what would that prove? He already knew who I was now, and more importantly, so did I. Some revenge doesn't need to be loud. Sometimes, you just sit still and let the message echo. "We need you," that's what he said. And this is what I'll say back. Let me tell you why I'm not coming. Subscribe if you're still listening. Because some stories aren't just about payback. They're about finally being seen. And this one's just getting started. Dominic Shaw arrived in a tailored suit and a 3-day plan to streamline operations. That's how he phrased it. The email said, "Excited to bring in fresh leadership and elevate the Aurelios experience. Subject all staff town hall, mandatory." I didn't go. Not because I was defiant, but because the email didn't mention tech infrastructure once. So I stayed where I always stayed, at my desk by the back exit near the freight elevators. The hotel had changed ownership twice in 5 years. I'd stopped expecting permanence. Later that week, he found me anyway. He walked into the server room like he was inspecting a wine cellar. Polished shoes, strong cologne, tablet under one arm. He didn't shake my hand. "You're Marcus, right?" "Yeah." "You're the guy who built all this?" He waved vaguely toward the racks of equipment, the screens, the quiet hum of uptime. I nodded. Yeah, that's mine. It's impressive, for what it is. That phrase hung in the air longer than it should have. I didn't say anything. I've learned silence is often the most accurate response. He kept going. Listen, I know you've been holding things together here, but we're moving to a more global framework. Standardized protocols, cloud-first architecture, scalable vendor partnerships. You know the drill. I didn't, not really. What I knew was how to keep our unique mess running without a single major outage in 5 years. I knew how to harden an event-based booking system against shady third-party requests and bad integrations. I knew that our biggest client, an international private equity group, stayed with us because no other hotel chain could promise zero data retention. But Dominic wasn't looking for logic. He was looking for scale. You've done great work, really. But at your level, we're not expecting long-term overlap. I remember those exact words. At your level. Like I was a stepping stone. Like I should have felt grateful just to be part of his version of progress. He smiled when he said it. That kind of corporate smile that already assumes your resignation will be clean, quiet, and documented. I wanted to ask him something. Just one question. How much of the code have you read? But I didn't, because I already knew the answer. None. The system I built didn't live on a brochure. It wasn't something you could pitch to investors in a slide deck. It was a spiderweb of logic layered with redundancies, encryption, bypass tokens, localized fallback triggers, silent alarms. I didn't design it for global compatibility. I designed it for discretion, for resilience, for people who needed silence more than branding. People Dominic would never understand. A week later, I was told I'd be transitioned out, not fired, just phased out. They brought in an integration firm from London, 3 consultants, matching laptops, pre-written templates. They held meetings where I wasn't invited. They asked junior techs to explain how the VIP routing worked. They nodded, smiled, and claimed, "It's all very legacy." Legacy, that word again. I watched them take apart what they didn't understand, line by line, piece by piece. They thought they were replacing me. But really, they were just removing the only person who knew where the real wires ran. On my last day, no one said goodbye. No card, no cake. No speech about all the midnight server saves or the last-minute firewall patches during peak holiday events. That's fine, I didn't need it. Before I left, I logged in one last time, opened the root directory, scrolled past the logs, found the file I had written years ago and never deleted. Fail-safe dimmed. Just one line at the bottom. If you're reading this, you failed the loyalty test. Then I closed the laptop, left my badge on the desk, and walked out the back exit like I always did. That was 2 years ago. Back then, I thought I'd move on. Maybe consult, maybe freelance. I didn't plan revenge. I just knew I wouldn't build for people who couldn't tell the difference between flash and function. But somewhere between silence and survival, I started thinking about all the systems I'd written for other people. Code that made them rich. Logic that protected them. Frameworks they never even noticed. Until they failed. And I realized something. They weren't paying for my code. They were renting my mind. And this time I decided to keep the keys. Most people think systems are just screens and dashboards. Something you click through. Something you see. But the real system, the one that matters, is the part you can't see. The logic underneath. The flow between requests. The silent checks, the failovers that no one ever notices. Because they're not meant to be noticed. I started building mine 6 years ago. Back then, we didn't have money for big vendors or branded integrations. Everything was held together with duct tape and late nights. But we had high expectations. Our guests weren't just wealthy, they were sensitive. Political donors, entertainment executives, foreign nationals traveling quietly. They needed privacy, not marketing. And we had to deliver it, without ever saying it out loud. So I built something from the ground up. A custom backend system that could manage tiered guest authentication, event-level access restrictions, token-based routing for anonymous bookings, one-time use payment gateways, emergency shutdown protocols. It didn't look fancy. No animated dashboards, no glossy interface. But it worked, silently, efficiently, and more importantly, securely. Here's what I knew. When someone books a $500, $1,000 event, they don't want to fill out 15 forms. They want to send one message and trust it'll be handled. So I wrote the logic to allow that. If a VIP guest was flagged in the system manually or via encrypted invite, everything adjusted automatically. Room assignment, elevator access, staff rotation. Even the route from the airport was set to sync with their arrival window. It didn't just manage logistics, it protected reputations. No one asked me to build it that way, but no one stopped me either. And once it worked, they stopped asking questions altogether. That's how most good systems live. Invisible. Until someone breaks them. I kept the license under my name. Legally, it was all in the fine print of the internal systems charter. But let's be honest, no one ever reads the internal systems charter. Especially not Dominic. When he arrived, he assumed everything could be rebuilt, outsourced, scaled. He thought if he just paid someone enough, the same logic would emerge. But logic isn't transferable. Not when it's built for people, not just data. And mine was, every single line of it. One of the features I built early on was called Ghost Entry. It allowed guests to arrive without ever being logged into the main reservation database. Their names never appeared. Their payments were handled through isolated temporary tokens that auto-deleted after 72 hours. Even the cleaning crew wouldn't know the room had been used. It wasn't just clever, it was necessary. There were guests who couldn't risk being seen even by accident. And for 6 years, not a single leak. Not a single flag from internal audit. Because the system did exactly what it was meant to do without anyone noticing. That's what made me dangerous. Not because I wanted to break anything, but because I understood how it all fit together. And because I kept a copy. Not to sell, not to exploit, just to remember. To remember what I built. To remember that even if they erased my name from the system, they couldn't erase the blueprint in my mind. There's a myth that when you leave a company, they own what you made. That once you step out the door, your work becomes theirs. That might be true for code on a server, but not for the idea behind it, and certainly not for the key that starts it. That part I never handed over. The consultants Dominic brought in tried to replicate what I built. I saw the documentation they sent around after I left. Standard vendor fluff. Buzzwords. Cloud native. AI ready. Zero trust architecture. It all sounded nice, but it had no bones. They didn't know where the pressure points were. Didn't know which clients needed exceptions. Didn't know what would happen if 2 events overlapped and the staff weren't rotated correctly. They had a system, but it wasn't mine. I never sabotaged anything. That's important. I didn't write traps. Didn't encrypt anything without sharing the keys. Didn't hide files or plant malware. All I did was hold on to the original handshake protocol. The one required to verify access for VIP routing. It wasn't malicious, it was standard security. And because no one asked me for it, I never gave it to them. Later, when the system started to fail, when VIP check-ins stopped going through, when anonymous bookings stalled, when the payment tokens bounced, they thought it was a glitch. They patched, they rebooted, they blamed vendors. But the truth was simpler. They'd removed the one person who knew how to hold it together. I wasn't watching, not directly, but I'd hear things from former staff, from vendors, from the texts they brought in. One message stuck with me. They're calling it a black box. No one knows where the root logic starts anymore. I always did, because I wrote it, in silence, line by line, year after year. They brought in the vendors like a rescue team. 3 consultants, 2 project managers, a cloud infrastructure partner from out of state. All dressed like success talking fast, carrying laminated charts. I knew the type. They came with decks and acronyms. None of them had ever debugged anything at 2 a.m. during a live wedding stream with high-profile guests and an unstable fiber line. But they had a vision, one that didn't include me. I didn't get a call to explain the transition. Didn't get asked where anything lived or how certain edge cases worked. They assumed that because they had credentials, the system would obey. It didn't. The first warning signs were subtle. A guest flagged as Private Tier A was assigned a standard suite. next to a bachelor party. One of the token-based payment relays failed during a discreet political fundraiser. Not a crash, just a delay, but enough to make the host nervous. A security key expired earlier than expected, and the front desk couldn't override it. That one made it into the daily report buried under minor operational delay. These weren't bugs. They were signs. Clues that the system didn't trust who was in charge anymore. By the third month, the consultants were in full spin mode. They called it a legacy misalignment. Said the previous architecture had undocumented behaviors. I had to laugh at that. Undocumented behaviors. Those were safeguards, built on purpose, for reasons they never bothered to ask. They thought documentation meant control. But documentation was only half the map. The rest lived in understanding why things were built the way they were. And they didn't have that. I heard from a former colleague, Sarah, the senior concierge, about a meeting Dominic held with the vendor team. He kept asking why it couldn't just be ported, why it wasn't scalable. One of the consultants said, "We're not sure where some of the logic originates." Dominic looked like he'd swallowed a nail. I wasn't surprised. They had spent hundreds of hours trying to rebuild what had taken me 6 years to evolve. They didn't even know they were working with a live system that had grown like a coral reef layer by layer, adapted to real-world use, messy but functional. And now, brittle in all the places I had reinforced quietly. They tried to rewrite the whole thing. Started migrating event handling to a new cloud-native platform. The rollout was staged. First the reservation layer, then guest access, then the payments. Each migration broke something small, then something bigger. They blamed staff training, blamed network latency, blamed vendors upstream. But the issue wasn't where the data went. It was how the system made decisions. And that logic was still mine. I never interfered, never logged back in, never touched a line of code once I left. But I didn't have to. The system wasn't rejecting them out of malice. It was rejecting them because it didn't recognize their language. The token routing had conditional access layers. It didn't just check credentials. It checked history. If a user hadn't been verified through the original onboarding structure, it blocked them. Not publicly, quietly. A timeout here, a retry there. Subtle delays that made everything look just unstable enough to lose trust. That's what they never understood. Stability isn't just about uptime. It's about confidence. If a VIP sees even one crack in the process, they don't come back. And when VIPs don't come back, neither do their friends. That's when I started getting the calls. Not from Dominic, not yet. But from others. Event planners. Former clients. People I'd quietly helped over the years when they needed things to work fast and discreet. "Hey Marcus, are you doing any freelance work these days? I heard the system's changed over there. Got anything new cooking?" At first I said no. I wasn't sure I wanted to build for anyone again. But then I remembered what it felt like. Building something that worked because I believed it should not, because it looked impressive in a meeting. So I said yes, to one, then another. Meanwhile, Dominic's vendors kept pushing forward. They redesigned the dashboard, migrated guest data into a centralized CRM, implemented automation for staff scheduling, and the system kept misfiring. Because it wasn't just software, it was expectation. It was built on real-world experience that couldn't be replicated in a Jira board. And every time it failed, my name came up in the background. They'd never say it out loud, but I knew. They knew. A friend from housekeeping forwarded me an internal memo one day. "We believe current instabilities are due to reliance on undocumented code from a former employee. Our team is exploring full decommissioning of the legacy framework." That made me smile. Not because they were failing, but because they still called it legacy, as if it were a ghost, as if the system wasn't alive and watching. They didn't know that by removing me, they had removed the one person the system trusted, and now it was simply doing what it was built to do: protect. Before I ever knew I'd be leaving, I created a file. Nothing big, just a plain text document, no passwords, no encryption, no secret script. Just a file. I called it Failsafe MD. I never mentioned it in meetings, never included it in the deployment pipeline, never drew attention to it at all. It sat quietly at the root level of the system, right next to the logs and the monitoring configuration, like any other reference note. But it wasn't for them. It was for me. At the time, I didn't think of it as a warning, more like a line in the sand, a reminder that what I built mattered, even if no one said it out loud. Even if one day they replaced me and called it an upgrade. Inside the file, I wrote just one sentence. If you're reading this, you failed the loyalty test. That was it. No explanation, no instructions, no signature. Just silence in black and white. Most people wouldn't even notice the file, especially not vendors. They're trained to look for config files, scripts, API keys. But this wasn't technical. It was human. It meant someone had gone digging. And if they had gone digging, it meant something was already broken. A few months after I left, I started wondering if they'd found it yet. I didn't check. Didn't need to. The system would let them access it. It wasn't hidden, but it wasn't meant to be found unless they were desperate. Unless the new architecture had failed to replicate something critical. Unless they were looking for answers they didn't have. There's a myth in tech that everything can be rebuilt, that if you lose a developer, you just hire another one. You copy the code, refactor, deploy. But systems aren't just logic, they're memory. Not the kind stored in RAM, the kind stored in decisions. Every workaround, every condition you added after 2 years of seeing what real-world failure looks like. That's what vendors never inherit. They inherit the skeleton, not the soul. The system had dozens of those decisions embedded deep inside. Things no one ever documented. Because I never expected anyone else to need them. Like how certain token requests would only pass if they matched a specific time window designed to prevent misuse by automated bots. Or how a VIP flag couldn't be created manually. It had to be triggered by a chain of behaviors over time, encrypted referrals, booking patterns, contact history. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. Because it was shaped by the people who used it, not the people who sold it. That's what made it resilient. And what made it resistant to replication. The vendors thought they could rebuild. And maybe they could have technically. But they didn't understand why it worked. And the system could feel that. Not in the literal sense. It wasn't artificial intelligence. It wasn't adaptive. But it responded to logic. And when the logic changed, so did the behavior. It's strange how systems reflect the people behind them. When I was there, it ran smooth because I cared. I fixed things before they broke, anticipated edge cases, tweaked little flaws before they ever reached the client. When they took over, it started protecting itself. Not because I programmed it to do that, but because I had designed it to prevent harm. And sometimes harm looks like incompetence. The system didn't crash, it slowed. Subtle delays, timeouts, fallbacks that never triggered because the conditions weren't right anymore. That's how it responded when it didn't trust the request. Like a door that doesn't lock but just doesn't open. That kind of resistance can't be debugged. You can't trace it to a bug report, can't isolate it with monitoring tools. It just feels like the system is reluctant, and to the people on the outside that looks like failure. But to the system, it's just doing what it was designed to do. Protect sensitive pathways, refuse unsafe access, preserve the chain of trust. I didn't plan it that way, but I also didn't stop it. And if someone read that failsafe.md file one day, I hoped they'd pause. Not to blame me, not to accuse me of sabotage, but to realize they'd missed something. That trust, real trust, can't be inherited. It has to be earned. Sarah told me later that the new vendor tried to submit a support ticket to the original system's open source shell. That made me pause. There was no open source shell. They'd found a repo someone forked from a sandbox I'd abandoned 3 years earlier, and they were trying to rebuild the core using it. That's when I knew they were truly lost. The failsafe file was still there, still untouched, still quietly waiting. And somewhere inside that system, somewhere they never bothered to look, it kept doing its job. Not because it had to, but because I'd built it with care. And that kind of logic, it doesn't vanish when the badge gets revoked. It stays. When rebuilding doesn't work, the next move is always the same. Start over. That's what they tried. After months of patchwork and escalating vendor calls, Dominic finally gave the go-ahead to dismantle the old system. Build a new one from scratch. Wipe everything that had my name on it. Replace it with something modern, global, scalable. The consultants called it a full migration. They set a 90-day target, 3 phases, new reservation engine, cloud-native guest management, integrated payment platform. It looked clean on the board. But clean rarely works in the real world. Within 2 weeks, the cracks started showing. The new system couldn't handle mixed-tier events. If a booking included both public guests and high-security clients, the routing logic failed. The reservation page hung on load. Guest profiles wouldn't sync across regions, and the payment tokens flagged as duplicates even though they were freshly issued. None of it made sense, until they remembered the fallback logic in my old framework. The logic they didn't understand, because they never asked. Sarah texted me one morning. They're starting to panic. Systems rejecting real VIPs now. Nothing works unless it runs through your code. I didn't reply. There wasn't anything to say. They weren't just rebuilding a system. They were removing its history and expecting it to behave the same. But systems like people remember who raised them. Then the legal questions started. An email leaked a quiet thread between Dominic and legal counsel. Do we own the underlying codebase Marcus developed? Or was it licensed? That was the first time I smiled in months. They had finally read the internal charter. I didn't hide anything. Not really. The framework I wrote had always been listed under a limited-use license. It was approved, documented, signed by the prior CTO, buried in a pile of onboarding paperwork no one had touched in years. I wasn't a contractor, I was staff, but I was also careful. And after what happened at the last place I worked where they took my code, stripped my name off it, and sold it, I learned my lesson. This time I kept the keys. The license wasn't malicious. It didn't lock anyone out. It simply defined limits. You could use the system, you could maintain it, but you couldn't transfer or replicate it without written consent. Which meant rebuilding it with a different vendor under a different name on a different architecture was a breach. They brought in a lawyer from New York, IP specialist. He confirmed it within a week. I didn't press charges, didn't threaten a lawsuit, didn't need to. Because they knew what it would look like if this got out. A 5-star hotel chain, built on stolen architecture. No guest would ever trust their privacy again. I heard Dominic tried to buy me out. A quiet offer through a third party. 7 figures, clean transfer, full rights. I declined. Not because of pride, not because of revenge, but because I knew what he was really buying. Not just the code, but the trust that came with it. And that's not for sale. They called an emergency board meeting. Options were presented. Keep patching the legacy system and hope no one noticed. Attempt a full rewrite with my cooperation. Shut down the framework entirely and rebuild the tech stack from zero. Each path had risk, but only one had me in it. By now, I had already signed with their competitor. A boutique chain with 5 properties and a better reputation for discretion. They didn't want flash. They wanted things to work. And I gave them that, quietly, efficiently. No marketing, no press release. Just a system that did what it promised. Meanwhile, the Aurelio's group limped forward. Their new system couldn't pass security audits. Several high-profile clients quietly canceled upcoming events. The guest satisfaction dashboard turned red. Dominic pushed for more integrations, more meetings, more solutions. But no matter what they did, the one thing they needed was already gone. I didn't enjoy watching it collapse, not really. But there was a part of me, some quiet part, that felt settled. Like the math had balanced out. Like the system had taken care of itself. If you've made it this far, maybe you've worked somewhere like that. Where your value wasn't measured until it was gone. Where they talked about upgrades and efficiency, but forgot that real systems are built by people who care. If you've ever left quietly while something you built kept going long after subscribe, you're not alone. While they were unraveling, I was rebuilding. Not from ambition, not for revenge, just out of habit. It's what I do. I rented a small studio above a bookstore in San Diego. The kind of place where the internet isn't fast, but the walls are quiet. Most days started the same. Coffee at 7. A walk down the alley by the harbor. Then code. No meetings, no Jira boards, no stand-ups. Just code. At first, I told myself I wasn't starting a company, just organizing old ideas. I opened up the architecture from the old framework, removed the parts tied to Aurelio's stripped-out brand-specific protocols, and rebuilt the skeleton clean. Not to compete, not even to release. I just wanted to see if it still worked without them. It did, better actually. Lighter, faster, more flexible. Word got around. The calls started slow. A former vendor. A hotel manager I used to troubleshoot for. Someone from a mid-size event company looking for a quieter solution. No one used the word private, but I knew what they meant. They needed something that worked. Something that didn't broadcast itself. Something built for the gaps between checkboxes. I started saying yes again. Not to everything. Just the right people. I didn't market it. Didn't post about it online. But by month 3, I had more clients than I expected. By month 6, I hired someone, just one person. An old colleague named Theo, who used to manage IT at a resort in Tahoe. We didn't talk much. Mostly just shared a repo and checked in once a week. It was enough. The new system didn't have a name at first. We called it Layer internally. Because that's what it did. It layered on top of other tools quietly. No takeover, no replacement. Just subtle logic added to fragile places. It worked like a second brain. One day, I got an email from a group in Europe. They were building a new boutique hotel chain, 7 properties all designed for high-end, low-profile guests. No chain branding, no loyalty programs, no digital footprint unless explicitly requested. Their head of operations had heard about me through a vendor in Miami. Said he wanted to talk. We had a call. 15 minutes, he asked one question. Can your system keep our guests invisible, even from us? I told him yes, because it could. That deal changed everything. We weren't just patching broken tools anymore. We were setting the standard. And the thing about standards is they spread quietly. First to one chain, then a partner company, then a booking platform asking for an integration. Suddenly, Layer was the thing behind the thing. The logic people trusted even if they didn't know it existed. And all of it started in a studio above a bookstore. Meanwhile, Dominic was still trying to salvage what was left. I didn't keep tabs, but people talked. Aurelios had begun losing key corporate contracts. Guests who used to request specific access tiers stopped booking. One of the city's biggest annual events pulled out of their flagship location 2 weeks before showtime. The system couldn't handle their demands anymore. Not because of bugs, but because it wasn't designed with them in mind. And by then, mine was. I got another message. This one from a contact I hadn't spoken to in years. He's asking about you. Dominic. Wants to know who's behind the system all his old clients are using now. I didn't reply. Let him ask. There's a point in every collapse where the people who caused it finally look inward. Not because they want to take responsibility, but because there's no one left to blame. I think he was getting close to that point, but it wouldn't matter. By the time he figured it out, the shift had already happened. Layer was running live in over a dozen properties. 2 event firms were rewriting their internal ops to match its flow. And a private security group had asked if we could adapt it for sensitive movement logistics. We could, and we did. I didn't rush the growth, didn't chase funding, didn't put together a deck. Just kept building, quiet, stable, useful, the same way I always had. And in the background, the same pattern kept repeating. Systems failing not from sabotage, but from forgetting why they were built in the first place. Trust. Discretion. Logic built for reality, not spreadsheets. That was the gap no one else could fill. That was what stayed with me when they told me I was too small time. Funny how quiet things grow. You water them. You give them space. And then one day you look up and they're everywhere. Not loud, not flashy, just present. The call came in at 4:12 p.m. I didn't recognize the number, but the area code was Miami. I let it ring. Then I let it ring again. At 4:14, another call, same number. I silenced it. A few seconds later, a voicemail dropped. I didn't listen to it right away. I had my own event that day. Smaller, simpler, but it worked. Across the country, in a hotel I once helped build, from the inside out chaos was unfolding. Aurelios was hosting their biggest private event of the year. Political guests, high net worth donors, a governor, and a foreign delegation that didn't want to be listed anywhere. Everything needed to run smooth. Everything needed to look effortless. But things were already cracking before guests arrived. The guest list failed to sync. Names weren't matching IDs. Digital passes weren't registering. Staff tried rebooting the mobile access points. Nothing worked. In the control room, techs scrambled to diagnose the issue. One said the guest entries were being flagged by the access system. Another said the encrypted tokens were expiring prematurely. The head of security started making calls of his own. By 4:30, they began checking guests in manually, with clipboards. Clipboards. At a 5-star hotel with millions invested in automation, they were handwriting room assignments, trying not to look panicked. Dominic was there, of course, in a dark suit pacing behind the event coordinator. Not yelling. Not yet. But people who knew him said his jaw was locked tight. Like a man waiting for a blow he could already feel coming. The event was scheduled to start at 6. By 5, there were whispers in the hallway. Someone had been turned away at the elevator. A guest whose name wasn't on the staff list even though she had RSVP'd weeks ago. Security didn't recognize the backup QR she showed. They said it looked expired. It wasn't. It just hadn't been routed correctly through the new system, because the logic layer it depended on didn't exist anymore. Meanwhile, the kitchen had its own issues. Custom dietary requests had vanished from the database. The staff had no idea which meals were flagged as allergies, preferences, or diplomatic sensitivities. The head chef stopped service, refused to guess. At 5:42, a member of the foreign delegation refused to enter the ballroom. Their assistant said the security protocols didn't meet minimum standards, said they'd walk. Dominic stepped in personally, assured them everything was secure. But the room didn't feel secure. Too many people checking badges, too many devices not syncing, too many handwritten lists. That's when he made the call. To me. I didn't answer, not right away. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while, watching the light blink. Then I pressed play. His voice was low, measured, a little tired. Marcus. I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear, but we're in the middle of something down here. Big event. System issues. We've tried everything. The original framework. It's still involved in parts of the logic and no one here understands it. If there's any way you could help whatever your rate is, we'd appreciate it. Just call me back. He didn't sound angry. He didn't even sound defensive. He just sounded like a man whose world had finally caught up with him. I didn't return the call. Not out of spite, not out of arrogance. Just because I didn't need to. He already knew. An hour later, I heard from someone who was there. A friend of a friend. She sent me a photo. A clipboard sitting on a marble check-in desk. A name crossed out in red. Below it written in block letters, "Access override failed." She didn't know what it meant, but I did. That line, those exact words, only appeared when the system couldn't verify the source of a custom access pass. It wasn't an error. It was a rule. One I had written years ago. Aurelios had tried to replace everything. New dashboards, new interfaces, new vendors. But the one thing they hadn't rebuilt because they didn't even know it was there was the trust protocol. The one that determined who got in quietly and who didn't. They hadn't removed the logic. They'd just disconnected it. And in doing so, they'd lost the only map the system respected. I put my phone down and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was starting to set behind the low skyline. Somewhere halfway across the country, Dominic Shaw was explaining to a delegation why a 5-star hotel couldn't get its doors to open on time. And he'd be right. The doors didn't open because the system didn't recognize the people standing in front of them. I listened to it again the next morning, the voicemail. Just once, then again, and once more after that. Not because I didn't understand it, but because I did. His voice hadn't changed much. Still polished, still calm, still trying to manage the damage with tone. But there was something different underneath it now. Something I hadn't heard before. Uncertainty. Marcus, I know this is probably the last thing you want to hear. He wasn't wrong. It wasn't the call I wanted. Not anymore. That call would have come years earlier when it might have meant something. Back then, I might have picked up, might have helped, Might have walked back into that server room and fixed it in 10 minutes. But the years had passed, and something else had taken root in the silence he left behind. Distance. We're in the middle of something down here. Big event. System issues. He kept the wording soft. Didn't say failure, didn't say crash, just issues. Still trying to stay in control of the narrative. Still holding on to the idea that problems can be managed with the right phrasing. But the system never listened to tone. It listened to logic, to intent, to the order of operations and who held the key. The original framework. It's still involved in parts of the logic and no one here understands it. That line stayed with me. No one here understands it. They had rebuilt everything they thought mattered. Rebranded, redesigned, replaced. But somewhere deep in the infrastructure, they were still running my code. Still relying on fragments of a logic model they'd written off. It was like trying to erase a foundation by painting the walls. I had always known they'd keep part of it. They needed it. Not because it was elegant. Not even because it was good. But because it worked. It had been tested, proven, trusted. Not by consultants, by time. If there's any way you could help whatever your rate is, we'd appreciate it. That's the part I listened to the most. Not for the money. I didn't care about the number. It was the way he said we. Like we were still part of the same team. Like nothing had changed. Like the last 2 years hadn't happened. Like I hadn't been walked out quietly. Like they hadn't wiped my name from the directories. Like the system hadn't been called legacy within weeks of my departure. That's what hit the hardest. Not the request, but the rewrite. I sat for a long time after it ended. No part of me wanted to answer. Not out of spite, just clarity. There was nothing left to say. The system had said it for me. You build something with care and eventually it carries your voice. Even when you're gone. Especially when you're gone. It speaks in the decisions you made quietly without permission. In the choices that don't show up in changelogs. In the warnings you never documented, but always enforced. It's there. In the way things fail when done wrong, and the way they hold up when done right. It's a kind of truth. The kind people don't notice until it stops working. Dominic had spent years building an empire on perception. Clean lines, big promises, impressive partnerships. But what held the real power were the things no one saw. A single verification handshake. A logic gate that only opened for known users. A rule that blocked override attempts if issued by unauthorized protocols. None of it flashy, all of it real. And it had nothing to do with ego. It was just math, built to protect what mattered. He had asked for help, offered to pay, left the door open. But there's a kind of silence that says more than any answer ever could. So I let it ring, and finally stop. That night I deleted the voicemail. Not out of anger, just because I didn't need it anymore. What he needed was never my time. What he needed was my trust. And he'd spent that a long time ago. The next morning I got a new message from a client halfway around the world. They were expanding. Wanted to run Layer in 3 new cities. I said yes. Then I opened my laptop, typed a few lines, committed a minor update. And somewhere buried deep in a private folder was a file I hadn't touched in over a year. Fail-safe, damned. Still there, still quiet, still true. It didn't happen all at once. Systems rarely fail that way. Not the ones built to last. They wear down quietly. A missed alert. A delay in response. A small rule forgotten until it matters most. That's how Aurelios lost their biggest client. It started with an event. Not a high-profile gala. Not a political fundraiser. Just a 3-day corporate retreat. 50 people. Private bookings. Nothing complex. Except it didn't go smooth. Check-in delays. Room key errors. Dietary notes lost in the system. Again. The client didn't complain right away. But they noticed. They always notice. By the time the final invoice was sent, the decision had already been made. The client canceled their next 3 events. Then requested their data be removed from the system entirely. No future bookings. No inquiries. Just silence. Dominic took the meeting himself. Tried to hold the relationship together. But the client's rep didn't give him a second chance. We're moving to a provider that understands our needs. We've already signed with someone else. That someone else was me. They never said my name, didn't have to. Dominic knew. The silence told him everything. I found out 2 days later. Not from the client. From a technician still working inside the hotel's back-end team. They'd seen the API logs, recognized the new structure, saw the token behavior. They sent me a message. Thought you'd want to know. They're calling it legacy lockout. That phrase stuck with me. Legacy lockout. I never built it that way. Never hard-coded a failure. Never planted a trap. All I did was write a system that responded to who was asking. If the identity didn't match the logic, if the pattern felt wrong, the system slowed, then paused, then withheld access. Not to punish, to protect. They had called it legacy the moment I left. Dismissed it. Replaced it. But the core they couldn't replicate was still running, still holding the line. I heard that Dominic called an emergency strategy session. Not to rebuild, not even to fix what was broken, but to talk optics, how to frame the loss, how to spin the transition, how to downplay the departure of a client worth 7 figures a year. He brought in marketing, legal, public relations, but the truth wasn't about PR. It was about function, about trust, about who you call when the lights go out, and who answers. I didn't answer, not because I couldn't, but because it wasn't my place anymore. The system wasn't theirs to control, and I wasn't there to explain why. 1 week later, Aurelius quietly removed a section from their website, a page titled Our Technology Advantage. It had described real-time guest tracking, predictive logistics, silent check-in, and multi-layer security protocols, all built on a system they no longer had. Meanwhile, Layer kept growing. Another boutique chain signed on, then an events platform, then a resort group in the Pacific Northwest. I didn't chase them. They came on their own. One contract at a time. No slideshows, no noise. Just systems that worked. Theo called me that Friday. Said he'd just onboarded 3 new clients without a single support request. They just get it, he said. It clicks. Like the system was waiting for them. I didn't say much, just listened. He wasn't wrong. That's how it was supposed to feel. Later that night, I opened the original documentation, the version I'd written long before anyone called it legacy. The header still read, Private Logic Framework, access by trust only. I hadn't changed those words in years. Didn't need to. They were never meant to impress. They were meant to hold. Dominic never called again. No more voicemails, no more back-channel messages, no quiet offers. Just distance. I imagined he moved on, or tried to. But some systems don't forget, and some failures follow you longer than expected. Not because of damage, but because of design. I didn't build my system to win. I built it to last, and in the end, that's what it did. I never gave it a name at first. It didn't need one. It wasn't meant to be a product, or a company, or a movement. It was just a system, built to solve a very specific kind of problem, in a very specific kind of place. And now, it was everywhere. Not in the headlines, not in app stores, not in trade shows, but underneath, running beneath reservation platforms, powering access control without drawing attention, connecting dots in silence. The system lived quietly, the way it was always meant to. Some clients called it infrastructure. Others called it middleware. Most just called it the thing that works. They didn't know the logic, didn't need to. They only knew that it behaved, predictably, precisely. That was enough. Theo and I kept the team small. Just a few developers. One ops lead, no executives, no salespeople. Every time someone suggested expansion, we asked the same question. Will this make it better? If the answer wasn't yes, we didn't do it. We didn't add dashboards. We didn't layer in analytics. We didn't build features for the sake of visibility. We kept the system quiet, because noise was never the goal. Sometimes I'd get emails, not often, but enough. People saying thank you, or just not saying anything at all except that things were working. Those were the best ones. The kind where the subject line was blank and the message just said, no issues. I'd read them once, then archived them. Proof that simplicity still mattered. The original code base, the one I started in that old hotel basement, still lived in our private repo. It had changed, sure, improved, tightened, but the bones were the same. The way the system moved, how it made decisions, that stayed. Because some logic isn't meant to be replaced, Just understood. We kept a changelog, but only for ourselves. No public releases, no version announcements. Just updates when needed. And every few months I'd open the commit history and scroll. 6 years of decisions. Some made late at night, some on instinct, some in silence after sitting with a problem for hours. It read like a memory, not of a company, but of a way of thinking. There was one part of the system I never touched again. The fail-safe. Still there, still buried, still saying what it needed to say. I never added to it, never revised the message. It didn't need improvement. It wasn't about them anymore, it was for me. A reminder of how things began, and why they mattered. I don't know how many properties run Layer now. I stopped counting. Some came through referrals, others just found us. No sales pitch, no onboarding calls. We sent them a key, they plugged it in. The system did the rest. If it didn't fit, it wouldn't run. Not out of malice, but because the logic was selective. Not everyone was ready for it, not everyone needed it. But those who did, they stayed. I think about that a lot, the idea of staying. In a world where everything updates, refreshes, rebrands, we built something that held still. Not because it refused to change, but because it didn't chase attention. It just did the work, quietly, correctly, over and over. That's what I'd wanted all along. Not revenge, not validation. Just a system that outlasted the noise. And somehow, that's exactly what it became. It happened quietly. No crash, no alert, no fire to put out. Just a line of text, on a screen, at the wrong time. One of our partner systems flagged a failed login attempt. Nothing urgent, just a notification. An unfamiliar user trying to access the configuration portal from an IP tagged as inactive client. That label isn't something we assign manually. It's baked into the logic. After a period of silence, no usage, no validation, no service heartbeat. The system marks it cold, dead weight. The access fails by design. No drama, no email. Just this, access denied. Local expertise can't be outsourced. That was the line. The one they saw. Or more accurately, the one he saw. Dominic. I don't know what he was hoping to find. Maybe a back door. Maybe a legacy credential that still worked. Maybe some way to re-enter the system he thought he could replace. But it didn't let him in. It didn't recognize him. Not anymore. He hadn't been part of it for a long time. Even when he was still employed. Even when his name was still on the org chart. The system doesn't care about titles. It cares about behavior. About intent. It listens and remembers. That message, it wasn't there to insult. It wasn't even meant to be seen. Just a quiet line in the denial script. A statement of logic, not feeling. But sometimes, logic tells the truth better than language ever could. I kept working. Didn't need to react. Didn't need to answer his attempts, because the system had already done what I would have done. Said no. Without anger, without noise, just no. I thought about him, though. Not often. Just then. Sitting in an office somewhere watching that message. Knowing what it meant. Not just about the login, but about the story. How it ended, where it left him, and why. There's something final about a locked system. Not because it keeps people out, but because it makes a decision, and that decision stays. There's no second key, no override from the outside, only what the logic allows. And when the logic is built on trust, you can't fake your way through. I looked at the screen one more time. The access log, the attempt, the rejection. Then I closed the tab, didn't screenshot it, didn't archive the record. Some things don't need proof, they just happen, and that's enough. Later that night I updated the deployment notes, version 3.1.4. Minor improvements, better encryption handshake, cleaner timeouts for dead sessions. No mention of the attempt, no entry in the changelog, just forward motion. Theo asked if I saw the failed login. I nodded. Do we need to worry? I shook my head. No, it already answered. There's a kind of closure that doesn't feel like a door slamming shut. More like a light turning off in a room you've already left. You don't need to go back. You just know it's dark now. And that's fine. I took a walk that evening. The streets were quiet. The buildings low and still. Some windows lit, most not. There's something peaceful about a city at rest. People going about their lives. Systems humming in the background. Things working not because anyone's watching, but because someone once cared enough to make them right. That's all I ever wanted. Not credit, not attention, just something that would hold. Something honest, built well, and left better than it was found. So if you've ever been overlooked, if you've ever been told you were too small, too local, too quiet to matter, remember you don't need the room to hear you. You just need the system to remember. And if it does, it will speak for you. If this story stayed with you, stick around. Some things aren't built to go viral. They're built to last.